I would like to first of all thank the organizers. Congratulations are due for conceiving and organizing this very meaningful mega event, bringing all the honorable legislators of the legislative assemblies and legislative councils of our country together. Particular word of congratulations, of course, to Dr. Vishwanath Karajji and Sri Rahul Karajji. So we are supposed to be discussing commendable legislative practices. Where do these commendable legislative practices arise from? Within our legislatures, among legislators, where do these commendable legislative practices arise from? I would suggest very humbly that they arise in any democratic polity. They emerge from the desire to successfully tackle, three distinct types of challenges. The first of these is the challenge of relationships, rishton ki chunauti. Now, what are some of these key relationships? One of the relationships is with other branches of government, with the judiciary, but particularly with the executive, holding the executive accountable by examining potential laws. For this, of course, a well-functioning standing committee system is extremely important. There is, for instance, now in the Lok Sabha, there's a pre-legislative review of all government bills. In Indonesia, there is a post-legislative scrutiny. So even after a bill has been passed, has become an act, the legislature continues to be involved in tracking what is happening. So the job doesn't end at the time in which a bill becomes an act, but the committees concerned will continue to see whether that is actually being operationalized on the ground by the government. In the case of Canada, for example, as has been pointed out, there are pre-budget consultations that are very in-depth. So the budget-making process is not only the responsibility of the executive branch. In Canada, the House of Commons, their Lok Sabha, plays a very active role in the entire process leading up to the budget. But this is, of course, only one of the relationships. Dealing with the bureaucracy, the permanent civil service, is a huge challenge for any legislative assembly, for any legislator. Dealing with social groups, dealing with civil society organizations, with interest groups, economic actors, all of these are key relationships. So, for example, in my state of Goa, obviously, you will necessarily have to take on account what are the needs of the tourism industry, because it is such an important contributor to the revenues of the state. So that kind of interaction with key relationships becomes very important. But also, as Honorable Speaker has already said, the relationships that exist within the legislature itself, the relationship that exists between legislators across party lines, is one of the most important relationships of all. And so when, for instance, there are disruptions of proceedings, it not only prevents the functioning of the legislature in the sense in which it should be done, but it sends a very bad message to society as a whole. So this is one challenge. The second challenge, I think, is what we could call the challenge of representation, pratinidhitva ki chunauti, which is the question that all legislators face, which is, who do we represent? After all, in a democratic polity, they represent the people. But do they represent just those who voted for them? Do they represent the electorate? Do they represent citizens as a whole? Now in South Korea, there's a very well-established practice of receiving and addressing public petitions. So groups of citizens can get together, make a petition to the legislature, and these petitions now in this era can also be done electronically, e-petitions, and they are, if a certain number of them has certain number of support, it is taken very seriously by the legislature. In Zambia, in Africa, there is a live streaming now of all the sessions of Parliament. So at any time, you can just go to one link on the computer and you can see what is happening on the floor of the House. In Chile, in South America, they now have something which they call the virtual Congress. They call their Parliament Congress there, Congreso Nacional. And you actually have a completely parallel thing consisting of the citizens, in which there's a very close interaction between the legislators and the citizens. And I think, when we think about representation, one of the key question is special interest versus the common good, because there will always be special interests in any society. Special interests are understandable. I gave the example of the tourism industry in Goa, but there are so many examples of special interests. But there's also something called the common good. And for all legislators, getting that balance between special interests and the common good is one of the key questions of representation. Then, of course, there are the voiceless. And I would say that the voiceless come in two categories, particularly in a country like ours, like Bharat. First of all, there are the voiceless who are the left out and the left behind. Those who just simply have not been given the full benefits that come with being citizens of a democratic country. So there's a particular burden on the legislators, upon or the legislative assemblies to focus upon the left out and the left behind. But there is also in today's era another type of voicelessness. And that voicelessness is of the planetary ecosystem itself. Who speaks for the environment? Who speaks for the planet? Who speaks for that complex web of life? All of animal life and plant life, the minerals, the rivers, the trees. Who speaks for the future generations? They are voiceless. And I think one of the big duties now for legislators, for legislative assemblies, is to think about the future, to think about the future generations, to think about the future of the planet. Because very often the executive branch is focused right on the problems of today. So भविष्य के बारे में कौन सोचेगा? मेरी समझ में विधायक ही जो हैं जो भविष्य के बारे में वास्तव में सोच सकते हैं. And finally, thinking about representation, there's another form of representation that I think is very important, which is history itself. Everything that a legislator does, everything that happens within the House that is done by a legislative assembly becomes a part of history. Whether we like it or not, nothing remains secret for very long. Everything becomes a part of history. So keeping in mind the legacies, the building of traditions, something to give to the next generation, I think is another very important aspect of representation. Finally, the third of the challenges from which these commendable legislative practices originate is what we can call the challenge of responsiveness. Anukriyashilta ki chunauti, jawabdehi ki chunauti, that how is it that these legislative bodies actually respond? One of the issues is a simple question of efficiency. What is efficiency? In a very simple way, it is the optimum use of time and resources. That's what efficiency is. It's the best use of time and resources. It is in that sense a procedural issue. Here in the context of our country, we can think about the length of the sessions of the legislative assemblies and the legislatures. We need to ask whether the length of the sessions themselves need to be made longer. In Italy, for example, they have a very sophisticated system for managing of amendments. There's an electronic submission system. And in the process, because it is done digitally, anytime an amendment is being proposed on the floor of the House, the system itself is identifying other related laws that will be affected if that amendment is done. So it's not like you do an amendment, you pass a law and then find that it is having an impact on other laws. So right at the time when it is being proposed, the system itself is alerting that these other laws are also going to be affected. In Kenya, there is a big pressure in their parliament for what is called evidence-based decision making. Then the other aspect of it is not procedural, but a substantive aspect, which is about civic virtue and about justice. This is a very important aspect of responsiveness, I will humbly suggest. Social justice, most important of all. We talked earlier about the left outs and the left behinds, but also gender justice. As we saw in UP, there was that day when the women legislators got their time in the House, but that ultimately is symbolic. It doesn't. We need to seriously at least start debating in our legislatures the questions of reservation for women, which was an issue that was begun, but it has, because of other complications, it has never been fully discussed. It functions on the whole quite well when it comes to local self-government, when it comes to the Nagar Palikas and the Panchayats. So we need to ask, maybe 33 is too high a percentage, maybe that percentage should be 15, 20. But these are some of the questions that I think legislators and legislative assemblies need to start asking, because gender justice is a very important thing. And as attitudes in our society change, as more and more of our daughters themselves are contributing very solidly and meaningfully to society, this becomes a very important issue. And also thinking about justice, environmental justice, so that the burdens of environmental breakdown are not felt only by the deprived in the population, but we are in a situation where we can actually assess laws ultimately in terms of the impact that they are having on the environment, on the future generations. Now, in the write-up which was distributed to all of us, there were many examples from many countries. This is what we call learning from others. But learning from others, there's a problem with it. It is a very thin line between emulating and mimicry, just doing what others are doing. And frankly, things that are done in other societies, in other political systems, do not necessarily translate very well to our own political system. So I actually believe that, rather than learning from others, learning from one another is a much better way to proceed, namely focusing on the best practices. I really applaud the initiative taken by MIT World Peace University to get this, the National Legislators Conference Bharat done, because for the first time on a single platform, the honorable MLAs and MLCs are meeting. They will be talking to each other. In the process, they will be discovering what some of the best practices are. And that is the way to proceed. I think instead of looking blindly at what's happening in other political systems, it's much better to look at what we are doing in our own countries. And of course, out here, we need to always have a proper balance between tradition and innovation. Tradition is very important, parampara, but also innovation. Naveen Karan is also very important. And getting that balance between tradition, the need for order, and innovation, which is the quest, the desire for progress, is very important. And on innovation, I will say only one thing, which is that we sometimes think innovation is about doing different things. But a significant aspect of innovation is about doing things differently. So you're not doing anything particularly new, but you're doing what you're already doing in different ways. Finally, and this applies not just to all the honorable legislators, but in fact to all of us as citizens, this is true about all human beings. Nothing really happens without effort, courage, and conviction, without effort, courage, and devotion. मेहनत, हिम्मत और लगन. मेहनत, हिम्मत और लगन की आवश्यकता है. And to the extent that this becomes sort of the ethos within our legislative assemblies, all of these commendable legislative practices that we are talking about will emerge. Thank you very much for listening to me so patiently. Thank you once again for the invitation. Jai Hind.